Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We will let folks get settled in and we will be starting momentarily. All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar, part 3, how do we continue organization and sustainability for school mental health screening with our presenter, Dr. Miranda Zahn. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Great Lakes MHTTC and SAMHSA. The Great Lakes ATTC, MHTTC, and PTTC are funded by SAMHSA under the following cooperative agreements. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speaker and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services and SAMHSA. The MHTTC network believes that words matter and uses affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. For more upcoming events and information, please follow the Great Lakes MHTTC on our social media and visit our website. We do have a few housekeeping items for you. If you have any technical issues, please individually message me, Alyssa Quala, or Rebecca Buller in the chat section, and we would be happy to assist you. If you have any questions for the speaker, please put them in the Q&A section, which is located in your toolbar, and we will do our best to get those answered for you. If captions or live transcript would be helpful, please use your Zoom toolbar to enable by going into the More section, select Captions, and Show Captions. At the end of this session, you will be automatically redirected to a very brief survey. Certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all who attended the session in full. Please allow up to 2 weeks to process. The recording and presentation materials will be available on the Great Lakes MHTTC website within a week following the presentation. I'm super excited and honored to hand this over to our presenter, Dr. Miranda Zahn. Miranda Zahn is an assistant professor of school psychology at the University of South Dakota. She conducts research, training, and technical assistance in school-based mental health services. Specifically, Miranda focuses on social justice and the role of teachers in school supports for youth mental health. In addition, Miranda is a school psychologist and school mental health provider at Nebraska's Educational Service Unit Number 1, where she provides direct services to youth as well as training and systems consultations to schools. Thank you so much, Miranda, for being here.
Hello all, thanks so much for joining today. I know that we've reached sort of the time of year that folks are starting to be on summer break if you're a school year employee. So I appreciate those of you who are joining today and those who might be joining later via recording. Today we'll be talking about sort of how to sustain an ongoing protocol of school mental health screening. You can watch the past couple webinars we've done that have recordings if you want to learn a little bit more about choosing a screener, building capacity at sort of the front end, and then the legal and ethical responsibilities associated with school mental health screening. Today, we're really going to get a little bit more deeply into how we sustain school mental health screening sort of once we've got it up and running and what it might look like over the long term to create a system that will be sustainable over time. Like Alyssa mentioned, my name is Miranda Zahn. I'm an assistant professor of school psychology at the University of South Dakota. I additionally have a couple different roles. So one of them, like Alyssa said, is as a school mental health provider myself in rural northern Nebraska. And I also consult for the National Center for School Mental Health, where I worked in the past on a more full-time basis. I right now join you from Massachusetts, where I'm about to be on vacation after our time together today. Right now I live in South Dakota on tribal land that has been historically occupied by the Sioux First Nations people. And before that was in Wisconsin and Baltimore, Maryland. My background and training are in school psychology. I received a PhD in school psych from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And then the lenses that I bring to my work and the things that sort of color or picture the way that I understand the world around me, and certainly impacts the way that I will communicate with you today, for better or for worse, is that I'm a white woman. I identify as cisgender, heterosexual, non-religious, middle class, and I have no visible disabilities. Today, as we spend our time together, the things that we'll focus on, or that I hope you will come away with, are some systems for progress monitoring mental health screening, understanding some timelines for ongoing mental health screening, and then recognizing the need, and maybe some concrete strategies for data organization so that you can sustain a system and not have Google spreadsheets all over with lost or inaccessible or unuseful information. To get us kicked off, I'm just going to briefly overview school mental health screening in summary. If you want to learn kind of more about what school mental health screening looks like, and defining it and how we measure it specifically, I encourage you to go back to those previous webinars. But for today, our brief primer is that universal school mental health screening represents a population-based preventative procedure through which we assess a person's likelihood of developing a mental health condition. Through universal mental health screening, we might use a variety of screening tools, particularly sort of surveys that are self-report, teacher report, or parent report, that allow us to capture some individual and shared risk and resilience factors that individuals in our communities or in our schools might have. These allow us to sort of understand where students are and what supports might be helpful or useful to them. Some of that is building upon strengths. Some of that is acknowledging or recognizing or noticing some of the points of risk. And part of that is also getting a baseline of where folks are when they're functioning well, perhaps, to understand when some change happens. I like to compare this to, we might go to the doctor's office and get our blood pressure and some other pieces of health information taken every time we go in. When we're healthy, it doesn't seem super necessary, right? It's like, oh, my blood pressure is fine. All of these things are okay. And that might be true. We might go back every year for 4 or 5 years and learn that everything's okay. Those vital signs are doing well. On year 5, there might be some change. When we go in early and our doctor can help us recognize that change through those few things that they measure, they can help us sort of dig in to understand what might be going wrong so that we can get the care that we need as soon as we need it. We're recognizing things sort of right when they come up because we know what our baseline looks like. We know what it looks like for us to be healthy. In a school mental health screening system, particularly when we look towards sustainability, our goal is really to screen everyone over time, just like we would in a doctor's office. Our goal is really to understand where folks might be when they're doing well, so we might notice a shift or a change and be able to intervene quickly so that we don't end up using that sort of wait to fail approach where we don't do much until someone is at a very heightened risk or is having more sort of impactful challenges on their daily life. So using the approach of universal school mental health screening, we might assess all students and then provide them the opportunity for early identification and aligned service provision. So we're making sure that all students in our system are sort of noticed, acknowledged, and get the things that they need. Some of the benefits of using a universal school mental health screening protocol are that we can reduce the risk or impact of mental health conditions by intervening early. We can obtain a baseline for future monitoring, like I mentioned, and it's also a cost-efficient approach. This really helps us do those sort of high leverage, simple practices that might be more preventative or attack those risk factors rather than waiting until an individual might need something like acute psychiatric care or sort of a more costly or resource-intensive intervention, which they might need if we wait until warning signs become really glaring. I recommend, and sort of best practices say, that mental health screening exists within an MTSS system. If you work in a school, you're likely familiar with MTSS on an academic lens, maybe on a behavioral lens through PBIS. Mental health screening is really just another way that we do MTSS, or another sort of angle of MTSS when we're thinking about mental health in schools. So I won't go super deep into what MTSS means overall, but in general, within the sort of mental health screening and mental health realm, what we might define as tier 1 would be universal, the things that we do for all students. So when we do universal mental health screening, we screen all students. We might screen climate as well. We might try to understand sort of how folks interpret the conditions of their environment, of our school. We might engage in school-wide or class-wide behavioral interventions, because those are something that everyone's accessing. And we might provide support through something like social emotional learning. At tier 2, through some of these tier 1 systems, we might identify those students who have risk factors, who might need some additional support, some more targeted interventions. So at tier 2, we like to see fewer students, maybe about 15 to 20% of our school population, who might need a little bit more, who might have some risk that we want to mitigate. For these folks, we engage in targeted mental health intervention. We might do small group intervention, and we monitor progress to see if hopefully they do well. We can push students back into sort of that universal pool, or if through our sort of brief interventions, if we learn that students maybe need something more, we can move them up to tier 3, where we would provide intensive school or community intervention and more progress monitoring to sort of shift and change what we do to make sure that we're matching the needs of the student. So I've got this graphic that also is included as a handout, and I went into a lot more depth on in the last webinar. So I encourage you to go back to that if you'd like to see this graphic in whole. But when we think about an MTSS school mental health screening system, what we think about at tier 1 is that universal screening. And we use a broadband measure. If you're interested in the types of measures we might use, webinar 1 went over that. So I encourage you to look back there as well. When we use a broadband measure, we look at whether folks screen positive or negative. Negative would mean they didn't have significant risk factors, and we are going to monitor that. We're just going to take their blood pressure like usual next year at the doctor, or we're just going to screen them next time we screen. If they screen positive and we see some of those risk factors, we then are going to validate through some second form of assessment, whether that's talking to teacher, talking to parent, talking to students themselves. Through that second gate, when we're validating, it's possible that we will see that a child really didn't have a need. One time that I've seen this is when we were screening for trauma, and one of the things that kids flagged on or screened positive related to was traumatic grief. There were some times that we went back and validated where we found that what they were describing as traumatic grief was something like they had had a pet pass away 4 or 5 years ago, and sometimes they thought about that and it made them sad, but they weren't really experiencing traumatic grief that was impacting their daily life. So they didn't, based on our sort of system capacity, they didn't kind of qualify for our next level of support. So if we validate at that second gate and find that really there is no need that's in alignment with our system, we just continue to monitor symptoms. They go back into our universal screening pool. If there is a need, however, we align that need with appropriate interventions, and we monitor progress as we deliver those interventions. If we see through monitoring that progress, a response to intervention, a student is improving, they're maybe matching their peers who screened negative in the first place, we can then discontinue those supports. That allows us to say, okay, what we did, they had the heightened blood pressure. What we did helped their blood pressure get back in control. And so now we're just going to go back to monitoring at our regular screening intervals to see if things maybe change over time. However, if when we give those tier 2 interventions, we don't see a response to intervention, we see that they maybe have an increased need, that might move them to that tier 3, where we continue with selected supports and progress monitoring and maybe increase the level of those supports. So this cycle overall, although, I made it, I like it, I made it with a grad student, and I think that it really illustrates the different things that we do in a school mental health screening system. It isn't super clear about timelines or about how we might decide when we implement different things. It could be really overwhelming for us to try to do all of this at once. Perhaps the 23-24 school year, you're looking to start universal mental health screening, and doing all of this could be really, really intimidating if you don't already have some level of infrastructure that is present in your school. So what we're going to talk about today is sort of what the bite-sized chunks are that you can access at first to sort of start to build a system. we're going to take this from a framework of implementation science, which teaches us through a lot of research-backed strategies, the ways that we might build a system and build some organizational structures that support sustainability. So implementation science refers to the set of practices that help us to understand, and it's sort of a timeline, linear framework that helps us to understand the different ways that we might implement a new practice so that we can install it with success and that we can continue over time. It is really common in schools for us to experience something called initiative fatigue. I'm sure all of you have seen this in one way or another, but frequently when we have changes in leadership or mission or vision of our organization, or someone with a shiny new product or tool comes along and tells us all the great things that we can do, we might adopt something, right? We may take on a new practice and we might use it for 6 months, a year. We might never actually install it. We might just buy all the things and without a plan to roll it out. And that can really lead us to being in a sort of stuck cycle where we never truly adopt and implement sustainably a system. And the only way that we really see the results we want to from any sort of innovation that we're implementing in schools is through implementing sustainably, something that we can do over time. For example, universal mental health screening, sort of when we think about how it might work or how it might benefit our schools, the ways that it benefits our schools, particularly when we think about monitoring over time, is through understanding a baseline and noticing when things go awry, noticing when risk factors change or when need increases. If we screen 1 year and do interventions that 1 year without attention to how we're looking at those same kids over time or how we're installing our systems, what we might see is that we identified 30% of students that year who had risk factors. We tried to play whack-a-mole to intervene on those factors. We decided, ooh, that was pretty overwhelming to try to intervene for 30% of our students, and we abandoned it altogether. What we know from implementation science is that it can take up to about 5 years for us to really get a system in place that allows us to sustain over time. We also tend to find that once we start measuring things, we see that our risk factors are higher than we maybe want them to be, higher than that 20%-ish that I mentioned before. And that tends to be because we haven't done universal intervention before to the extent that we might need to. So all that to say that if we don't implement our system sustainably, what we're going to see is overwhelm, and we're going to see systems that feel flipped, right? Because we're still dealing with playing whack-a-mole with those students who have tier 3 needs, who are maybe need acute psychiatric care, who we're referring for outpatient, who were getting walkie-talkie calls if you work in schools like I have, because they have behavioral and mental health needs throughout their school day. We're working there, and we're also trying to work from the bottom. What we see is that in those initial years, if we bite off maybe more than we should, we see that those two kind of buckets that we're trying to work towards simultaneously overrun our capacity pretty quickly. So when we're implementing something like school mental health screening, it's important that we start slow so that we're not totally in both of those buckets at the same time, in the bucket of whack-a-mole at tier 3 and universal, because when we try to do those, give those both our full attention, we end up not being able to sustain. So I recommend, and implementation science indicates that one way, and what I think is the best way to install a new system is through these phases of implementation science. The first phase is exploration. I'm going to go into each of these in more depth on the coming slides, but exploration is kind of the first year. It's where we're deciding what we're going to adopt. It's when you might attend webinars to think about the practices that you want to install over time. After we've gone through exploration, we've identified what we want to adopt, then we start with installation. This is preparing ourselves for readiness. What this might look like is we've decided what we're going to do. Now at installation, we're training the folks who are going to do that work. We're purchasing the infrastructure, right? We're purchasing the surveys. We're purchasing the software that we can use to manage our data. We're doing those sort of pieces that will allow us to hit the ground running when we're actually implementing. Installing is sort of getting all those things ready. Then we move towards initial implementation. I think that's really, really important that this is initial. This is sort of when we're biting off that sort of manageable chunk of implementation. We might start in universal mental health screening with something like 1 grade level, 1 classroom, so we can get a sense of what's to come, and we can sort of troubleshoot some of the things that we might be seeing. Following initial implementation, once we've noticed some of the pitfalls, we've created some solutions for those, we might move forward into full implementation. Full implementation is achieved once we reach a point where we're confident that the system will change, that this system can continue, that this system can persist, even with things like shift in leadership, even with things like shifts in funding, when we really feel like we've got a system that's sort of, we've got a train that has left the station and it's moving in a direction that will continue because we've got kind of critical mass and it's a practice that's part of our daily sort of practices within the school. What frequently folks will sort of abandon practices before reaching full implementation because they're not seeing the full results yet. We wouldn't expect to see the full results until we reach full implementation. For that reason, I really encourage you to spend a lot of time at this sort of left end of the screen with exploration and installation so that we are building capacity. We're only adopting practices that we feel committed to, that align with our mission and vision, and that we feel confident will make an impact on our students. I feel confident that screening will have an impact on your students if you use it within a tiered system, but that's also something that you're going to need to decide with your local school, your community. Maybe the school board has to provide approval, administration needs to provide approval. And I talked about some of the ways that you might build those, you know, the buy-in of those invested parties in webinar 2, which I encourage you to look back on. So this whole course takes 2 to 5 years. I think with a system like school mental health screening that really requires that you're also implementing MTSS, we're probably looking more in that 5-year range. We might be at 2 years if your goal is simply to screen every student and you're not looking at the sort of referral pathways or intervening. But really, if we're installing screening within a tiered mental health system in our schools, it'll probably take more like the 5 years. If you're in a really big system, it might even take longer. So these are some of the pieces of implementation science that I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into sort of what they look like. So exploration is that first phase. Perhaps it's the phase you're in now as you're learning a little bit more about screening by joining us today. But exploration is really the stage where your tasks are to identify a need for change, to learn about potential innovations, right? So to learn about what's out there, what might help you solve your problem that you've identified. You learn about necessary resources. So here's where you might start to identify, what do we need in order to do school mental health screening? We need you know, forms for opt-out consent. We need a spreadsheet that we can use to track data. We need the tool itself. We need to be able to dedicate 30 minutes every couple of months in our 6th grade health class. You learn about the resources that are necessary and decide how you're going to move some levers in your system to make those resources available to really kind of do the thing that you intend to do. This is also the phase where you'll develop a team. I talked a little bit more about teaming in webinar 1 and sort of who might be at that table, but really you want this to be folks who are impacted by the policies and innovations you might adopt and who also have some control over the sorts of levers you might need to move, like resources from the people or labor angle and also resources from the financial angle. Want to include all those folks on a team in addition to folks who have content expertise. Then in exploration, we really need to assess and create readiness for change. It is common for this to be a place where we're spending the bulk of our time in exploration. Frequently, we'll have a champion or a few champions within a school system who are really committed to something like mental health screening or using a tiered system for mental health supports in the schools. And what we really need is that sort of critical mass in order to get a sustainable system running. So we might spend a lot of time in our exploration stage to assess and create readiness. What that might look like is the content expert, who I'm assuming for many of you might be you, in your system. You're the person who maybe knows what screening is, who is invested in doing mental health support in schools. And so you might come and present some research to your school board. You might talk about case studies of schools near you that have done something like universal mental health screening. And you might use those as sort of leverage points to get other folks to understand why screening might be the right thing for your system. We also need to be honest with ourselves about the potential of readiness for change. There are some school systems that simply might need several years of building sort of investment in youth mental health before something like screening is possible. We want to make sure that we're not putting the cart before the horse, because we know that when we're looking at a 5-year implementation plan, folks who aren't bought in are likely to abandon practices quickly because they maybe never believed that it was going to work. And they see after a year or 2 years that we haven't achieved the promised results. We haven't gotten to a point where our student needs are 0. And they might say, hey, that's not working. I never thought it was going to work, and throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So we really need to be honest with ourselves about the ways that our systems function and about taking the time to build readiness for change so we don't set ourselves up for a system that will abandon practices. Once we've gotten through that exploration stage, our next phase is going to be installation. This is when we're securing and developing support for the new approach. We're saying we are doing this, the decision has been made, and we need you to get on board. Here we might look for champions within school buildings. We might be looking for ways that we can train people or share information about how helpful school mental health screening might be with those invested parties in our school system. We're going to hear secure resources for adoption. So this is when we're buying the protocols, we're getting the book, we're creating the spreadsheet. We're also here developing feedback loops. When we're in the next stage, it'll be really critical that we get feedback regularly about the ways that we are going to implement, right? So we need to identify the pitfalls. We need to notice when things maybe aren't going as planned, and we need to have a way to solicit and receive feedback about the ways that things are going so that we can make those changes promptly and in ways that are helpful and supportive to those who are doing the work of school mental health screening. So at the installation phase, we need to identify the ways that we're going to solicit that feedback so that it feels natural and predictable when we solicit feedback afterwards. Then we want to gather feedback about new practices sort of at the front end. We might have parents and teachers who say, I'm concerned about X, Y, or Z. There might be some challenges that can be anticipated, that even before the sort of feedback loops that will follow, we can identify some of the potential pitfalls and try to pre-correct for them. For example, if we're asking teachers to fill out the surveys themselves, and that's going to take an hour of planning time once every 3 months for them to participate in screening, teachers might say, hey, I don't know when I'm going to find that time. We might be able to anticipate that there's going to be a lack of time, and we might be able to install some sort of mechanism for preventing that from becoming a problem. We might say that on the week that you're expected to do school mental health screening, we're going to make sure there's a PD day and you have an hour of reserved time to engage in this work. We want to make sure that at the outset, we're sort of preventing as many of those challenges as possible so we can increase the level of success we might find when we're rolling things out. One of the things that I really recommend you think about as you're thinking about installation and initial implementation is that you identify the way that screening is going to look. I gave you before that sort of complex cycle with all those boxes around of what things look like, but that can feel really intangible to folks who haven't done screening before. And really focuses on the MTSS rather than the like, what do we do in September? And so I provided here a timeline for screening and what I suggest this might look like. And it really follows the way that we screen for other things like academics. Many schools use something like MAPS or AimsWeb to understand the needs for intervention in reading. And they tend to do those screenings at regular intervals so that we can notice change over time. That's the same thing that we want to do with mental health screening. And here I'll illustrate sort of what that timeline might look like in a school. So first, once you're at sort of initial implementation, this might be something you pitch in installation, but you're not doing it yet. Something that you might start with in the year that you're doing your initial implementation is screening right away in the fall. It tends to be that fall screening we want to set a little bit into the school year, maybe like a month into the school year, because we're frequently asking teachers to rate student behavior on screenings. And so we want to make sure that teachers know their students well enough to make informed decisions and informed ratings. So about a month into the school year, we might do fall screening. This is a time where we might catch folks who maybe had some disruption over summer, folks who are new to our school system, folks who have, maybe reached a new developmental period. There are many folks we might catch in fall screening. And the great thing about fall screening is that it gives us a whole year to make change and to notice the things that we can do for those folks who have an increased risk. So fall screening might happen in mid to late September, maybe early October, depending on when your school year starts. Following that fall screening, if you'll think back to that diagram with all the text boxes that I showed before, you're gonna have folks that screen in or screen out. If students screen out, we're seeing that they don't have a high level of risk that requires intervention. Those students, we might provide a universal intervention. For example, if there are shared risk factors, if we're seeing like students are generally doing well, but all of the first graders are having difficulty coping with feeling disappointed, right? We might say, all right, well, we're going to do a couple lessons with all the first graders who seem to be lacking or need some support in this skill. We might do that with everyone, but we're not singling students out unless they've kind of risen to that level of individual risk. For those students, our next step is going to be screen them in winter. We're not doing a whole lot in between because we're seeing that they're doing okay. This is like the, one year we went to our physical, we got our blood pressure taken, it was fine. And our doctor just said, come back next year. We don't need to do any follow-up testing. You're okay right now, but I want to see you back so we can see if anything changes. These are the students who aren't at risk, who we will just lump in with our winter screening pool. However, there will also be students who are at risk in the fall. This is, I think, some of the most promising time to provide interventions because we've all done a school year. We can get really overwhelmed once we get past fall, but fall is a time that we tend to be eager. We tend to have a lot of energy and enthusiasm for the upcoming year. And it's a time that we might be able to install and implement new practices like intervention. So for those students who are at risk, who are flagged as at risk, we're going to use that process of validating, making sure that the screening information, the data that we got was accurate, that they really do have a need. We're going to provide that tier 2 intervention and progress monitoring. Generally, that tier 2 intervention would look like 6 to 8 weeks of a brief, maybe group intervention or 10 minutes a week check-ins, but it's not going to be super resource intensive because this is sort of our starter intervention. If that intervention works, fantastic. We discontinue the intervention and we put them back into the pool for winter screening. Even if we don't see positive changes from that tier 2 intervention, all of our kids are still going to be screened in winter. If we didn't see that positive outcome at tier 2 intervention, what we might do is refer to tier 3 if we see that increased need and need to do something maybe more intensive for that student. If we do see gains, we'll just filter them back to tier 1 monitoring. Then we do our winter screening. Often folks will do this right after coming back from an extended winter break, so maybe mid-January. And what that looks like, again, is pretty much the same as fall. For the students who aren't at risk, we haven't seen significant change over time for, we're just pushing them through. We're going to screen them again in spring, see if anything changes, but for now, they look okay. It looks like they're doing well. And for those students, we then screen again in spring. We want to make sure that there's some time when we do the spring screening to do things like intervening. So we want to make sure that if our school year ends mid-June, we're not doing our spring screening the first week of June. We really want to be doing that spring screening something like mid-March, maybe the first week in April, but we want to make sure that there still is some time for us to act on the information we've collected. For the students who we see as at risk, again, from the winter screening, we're going to validate that. We're going to do tier 2 intervention and progress monitoring. And either depending on sort of how that tier 2 goes, we're going to refer for tier 3 intervention or refer back to that tier 1 monitoring. They're just going to screen again. Following spring screening, this looks the same, right? For students who aren't at risk, they're just going to get screened again in the fall when they come back after summer. And if they are at risk, we're going to use those couple of months left in school to try to give a boost and then screen again in fall to see if we have done enough boosting. So that's sort of our overall kind of year timeline. So hopefully that's helpful as we think about our initial implementation. So initial implementation looks like extending those practices to the sort of first students who are going to be screened. Here's when we're doing our final training. We're making sure that everyone's on board, everyone knows what our timeline is, everyone knows what their participation will look like. And then we're rolling out the screening. This might, I suggest, look like maybe we're doing screening with one class or one grade level, or if we've got a large district, we might do it in one elementary school. So we can sort of work out the kinks before we're asking everyone to adopt something. Because if we ask everyone to adopt something and then we need to make changes, that can become confusing. So you're demonstrating our first use of our new innovation, and we're going to expect that some things are going to go wrong. There's going to be some sticking points that we'll need to resolve. Here, in order to understand where those sticking points are and what we need to do, we can gather data about implementation. So here we're going to be using those sorts of feedback loops we established in installation. We're going to gather data, and data can look like a lot of things. It can look like surveys. It can look like talking with the teacher down the hallway about what went well and what didn't. We're going to gather information through those feedback loops that we established about how things are going. And then we're going to refine our approach. On the next slide, I've got a way that I think it's really helpful, and again, implementation science tells us is really helpful to improve when we implement something and that there is room for improvement, which is pretty much always. So first, plan. So we talked about the plan that happens in exploration and installation. We make a plan for a change. Here we might also, once we've implemented in our initial implementation phase, we've implemented the beginning of screening. We see that one of the kinks is that teachers don't know their students well enough at September 15th when we chose to screen. We might make a plan for change, which might look like next year we're going to have them screen October 1 instead, so they have a little bit more time to know their students. Then once we've created the plan, we've identified that sticking point and brainstormed the best way that we can anticipate to fix that problem, we implement the change. Then we study, we measure the effectiveness of that change. We ask teachers, hey, did you feel like you knew your students this time around? So we're really responding to the feedback that we've gotten before to identify whether or not our change made a difference or if there's further need for change. We're gathering data here again, and data can look really flexible. It can look like those hallway conversations, or it can look like something more systematic. And then we act. So once we get that data, we understand if the changes worked, then we determine any modifications and we can continue our practice. It is really, really great when we can use multiple PDSA cycles throughout our implementation. So there are going to be kinks that come up, there are going to be challenges or problems that emerge as we are working through implementation. And so it's really helpful to maybe every time you have a mental health team meeting, you might think about what PDSA cycle you need to do now, what thing needs to change, what do we need to refine our process for? I encourage you, so this Connors article at the bottom, Elizabeth Connors out of Yale University and the National Center for School Mental Health has done this study about the ways that folks have done PDSA cycles for continuous improvement, specifically within the domain of screening. So you can get a really great understanding of the ways that you might need to change or refine screening protocols over time. If you're not affiliated with the university and don't have an ability to access that article, feel free to email me and I can send it to you. Then we've done PDSA cycles. We've sort of worked out some of the kinks of our protocol, and we can move towards full implementation. This is when we're expanding our use. So if we implemented at first in one elementary school through initial implementation in those PDSA cycles, we maybe got to 10 elementary schools of our 24. We're now saying we're going to increase every year until we get to every elementary school rolling out universal mental health screening. At this point, our innovation should be well integrated. Screening should just be part of how we run our school. It's not this practice that is uncertain. It's not something that teachers are unfamiliar with and scrambling because it's something that was sprung upon them at a staff meeting that they didn't know about. This is something that is kind of on cruise control. Everyone knows what to anticipate, and we're moving ahead in a way that is sustainable. Here we have routine and effective support for the practice. So in the case of screening, everyone knows who they might talk to about screening. They know who they get the protocols from or who sends out the survey link and when that'll happen. We're creating a routine for sustainability. We also, at full implementation, sort of our goal is that the practice will persist even with leadership or funding changes. We know these happen a lot in schools. It is common to get a new principal every 2 or 3 years. It's common for superintendents who come in to have a new mission and vision. And full implementation really would look like screening being such an established practice in our system that those leadership changes or those changes in mission or vision or the tweaks won't disrupt what we've got going on because it's such a part of our rhythm. So that is sort of the end of that broad up in the clouds implementation and sustainability component of today's conversation. And now I'm going to move to a couple of tips and tricks for data management. This is something that I think really can get in the way of sustainability because frequently we're in systems where we've collected information about something once or twice, and we've got a spreadsheet somewhere that Rob shared with me, but I can't find in my Google Drive. And we frequently can lose data. And so then we're not acting on it to make decisions about the types of care that we might install for students. So I think that, a really important or, good way to talk about this is by reminding ourselves that what gets measured gets done. We know that in the era of school accountability and standardized testing and screening for academics, we've learned that the types of things that we measure, for example, state standardized tests are the things that we're focusing on, the things that we're trying to make change in. And if we're trying to make change in the mental health and well-being of our students, we really need to be measuring and then following up on that measurement. So there are some screening tools or suites or protocols or companies that have shiny, flashy data management systems. These are really, really great. I recommend that folks really weigh the costs and benefits of using a free tool that you'll have to manage your own data with versus using a tool that you might pay a per child expense, but then you have some sort of automatic and algorithmic data management that occurs, because frequently what I see when schools try to roll out something that's free and seems really accessible is that we're spending that extra money in the time that it takes for us to manage the data, right? So when we think about the folks who work in schools, those folks who maybe have mental health expertise, hopefully get paid a living wage, and that adds a lot of cost when we're thinking about someone needing to spend their time and talents on spreadsheet management rather than mental health intervention, for example. So what you might currently have might be a spreadsheet with absences and tardies. You might have a spreadsheet with Fs. You might have a spreadsheet with that tracks exclusionary discipline. You might also have SWIS, so a school-wide information system like Infinite Campus or Power School, or some others that allow you to have sort of a dashboard. Those are really helpful, and I'm not going to provide specific advice for those because I think often they're pretty intuitive and can be worth their cost. For school systems that struggle with the financial resources or adopting a new thing like a software, we're often using spreadsheets for our data. There are a lot of ways that we use spreadsheets inefficiently, and I'm going to go over some of the ways that I think that you can set up some spreadsheets related to school mental health that can allow you to maximize your use of data so you'll actually look at it rather than simply sort of moving through kind of and looking at it once after you've collected the data and then letting things dissolve. So some things that I recommend are using conditional formatting. You'll see here a spreadsheet that I made with all fake data. None of this is real. But I made up some arbitrary numbers about screening data. And so here you'll see that there are columns for fall screening, winter screening, and spring screening. I recommend that you kind of include everything all in one spreadsheet so you can look at change over time. And what I do is I'll highlight some of the columns that I want to be able to show some information about. This is on Google Sheets, and I right click and hit conditional formatting. And I can actually, you'll see on the right-hand side, I can create some filters that will show me when the data looks certain ways. So I made up arbitrary cut points. There's not a real screening here. This is not real anything, but I pretended that at risk, or that sort of tier 2 or on the cusp score for this fake screening would be between 4 and 6. For those kids who were between a 4 and a 6, I wanted to see on this spreadsheet that they were flagged, that I might want to do some validation, some follow-up, but we weren't sure maybe what was happening. And then I said that for my fake screening tool, that a score of over 6 showed that there was definitely some level of risk. You can see through the conditional formatting on the left that this gives me a pretty sort of intuitive way to look at the data where I can see how things are changing over time. If you look at row 14, Katie Quinn, we see that Katie went from a 10, which is definitely at risk, to a 7, which is still at risk, to a 5. So Katie's score, as we screen over time, is going down. Katie might be a student that we might pull the teacher and say, hey, what's happening with Katie? Like, things are really improving for Katie. Are we doing an intervention that's really effective? And how can we expand that to more students because it's really helping Katie? There are other students, for example, we see at the very top, row 2, Becky Zimmerman had had a 3 in fall, but we weren't really concerned about it. In winter had a 0, and in spring had a 4, right? We're starting to see some of that higher level of risk creep in. So we might follow up with teacher or parent and say, hey, it looks like Becky kind of is sometimes doing really well, but lately things have been perhaps a little bit harder based on our data. Like, what's changed and what can we do right now to maybe mimic the things that were helping Katie in fall and winter? So this can be a way that we can really intuitively look at our data to understand some patterns and systems over time to tap into what's working. Another thing that I find super helpful as I'm organizing data is pivot tables. So these are something that a lot of folks who use Excel or spreadsheets might be familiar with, but what you can do is you can create a pivot table based on data. So what I did here is I had highlighted an entire spreadsheet. So you'll see the bottom left, you see tabs for different things. You'll see a tab for attendance. I highlighted that whole sheet, the entire attendance sheet, right-clicked and clicked Make a Pivot Table. So you'll see now there's a tab for Pivot Table 1. This is based on my attendance data from the spreadsheet. What I then created is on the right-hand column, there's a Pivot Table Editor. You can move things around so that you see data reflected in ways that sort of summarize. So what I did here is that I wanted to see what absences or our attendance looked like over time by grade. So I can see here that if I look at the grand totals in row 14, I can see that my numbers are sort of stable over time. But if we look within each grade, my numbers look really different. We see that some grades have an increased risk of attendance challenges or absences. Something that I can do once I've moved around my different pieces of data through this pivot table editor is I can then do some formulas in column F to the right that you'll see here to see sort of where my risk changes over time. Here, I just did a simple sum. I added up what was on the left to see where my maybe risk factors differed. We can see here, we could see maybe visually that in column 8 or row 8, grade 7, we see more absences. And then when we look to the right, we see that that persisted throughout the whole year. There were 94 absences in 7th grade compared to considerably lower numbers elsewhere. If we go, I'm going to go back a couple here. We see this is the same data that I used. And here it's a lot harder to see what my patterns are. I wouldn't see from looking at this spreadsheet just visually right now that 7th graders have a ton more absences, right? I just see a slew of numbers across the screen. But when we use something like a pivot table, we can actually see where our trends live. And this can help us summarize data in a way that, again, is intuitive and allows us to notice patterns, which is the most important part of using data, right? Noticing patterns so we can know how to intervene. Some other tips and tricks that I recommend you look into if you're interested in shoring up your data management systems, perhaps by using a spreadsheet, are the count if function that you can use to identify cases that meet certain conditions. So if I want to find kids who were at risk both in fall and in winter, I can use this function. I recommend that you look into there are some really good like YouTube videos that might show you how to do each of these, but I'm just going to go through the ones that I've found really helpful. Some I've used to just add up how many maybe times a kid was absent over the year. VLOOKUP is a way that you can get data from multiple spreadsheets into one place. You can sort of collate your data. That one is a little more complex, but I've found it to be one of the most helpful things I've learned about spreadsheets. And then you can do the if you want to identify some condition. So if you say, I want to know a flag if a student misses more than 20 days, right? You can create an if statement. And then concatenate is one that you can use to combine some data into a particular cell to sort of collapse some things. That's really helpful. I recommend that you look into ways to use some of these things that are built into spreadsheets to manage your data, because you want your data to be intuitive to use so that you and other team members can look back at it and use it over time rather than just looking at the data once when you collect it and then abandoning it, because that won't help you build a sustainable system that will monitor over time, which is really the purpose of screening. So, sort of just summarize, continuous improvement is better than delayed perfection. We want to take time to install things the right way so that they can be maintained and are sustainable over time by using practices like making sure that we're garnering buy-in and continuously improving and getting feedback on our systems, rather than trying to implement screening day one, expecting it to work, and moving forward and abandoning it if it didn't work perfectly right away, because perfection is really challenging and continuous improvement can sort of get us where we need to go. I'm including here some resources for screening overall. One on the bottom that I want to point out that's new for today is my favorite way to learn spreadsheet tricks. There's a link if you download the slides to a YouTube site by this person, Layla, who does a really great job of explaining a lot of tips and tricks that you might use on spreadsheets. So now I can take a couple of questions, and I'm going to go in the Q&A chat box. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A chat box. If you have something that you maybe want some more support with, feel free to contact me directly. My info is on the screen. So first I see, how do you prepare the schools if a large number of students need intervention? What if you don't have counselors, social workers, and school psychologists? So something that I talked about in session 2 was sort of what it might look like if you're pyramid is inverted, so to speak. So what that might mean is that we're playing a lot of whack-a-mole at tier 3. We've got a lot of those needs that are really challenging, and we're having a hard time, intervening, or it feels impossible based on the capacity of our system to intervene with all of the students who might need help. What I recommend then is that we do more universal intervention. We do more things where we're pushing into a whole classroom. Another thing that I recommend there is really being intentional about biting off what you can chew. So I recommend sort of starting, if you're concerned about your system's capacity, starting with one grade level, one cohort, one school, to think about sort of what your base rate, so to speak, might look like, so that you can understand what the level of need is, so you can build more capacity. You can maybe use that to leverage some information to get what the resources that you might need. Then we have a question, whether we can use info on the slides to train staff and give credit to presenter. Absolutely. I hope that you find this information helpful, and you are welcome. The slides are all going to be posted. The slides from sessions 1 and 2 are already posted on the MHTTC website. So I encourage you to use this information in ways that will be helpful, because getting mental health screening into more schools will hopefully help kids. Those are all the questions that I see in chat. So I'm going to turn it over to our MHTTC staff to lead us out and tell us more about the recordings that are available and the eval that you all can do.
Thank you so much, Miranda. This was so great and informative. You got a lot of great feedback and praise in the chat. I wanted to give you all a quick reminder, and I did put these in the chat. At the end of today's session, you will be automatically redirected to a very short survey. It would be greatly appreciated if you could fill this out, as it does get back to our funder, and it does allow us to continue to provide free trainings to you all. Certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all who attended the full session today. This may take up to 2 weeks to process, so reach out to us after the 2-week mark if you have not received that, and make sure to check your junk and spam folders. And then, as Miranda also said, the recording and presentation materials will be available on our Great Lakes MHTTC website. I will start processing the recording following today's session, so that should be up by the end of this week. So if there's no other questions for Miranda, I want to thank you all for joining us, and hopefully you were able to gain so much insight, and you can use the materials on our website. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you all for joining.